The air inside the county auction hall was thick with heat and disinterest. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a washed-out glow over worn-out chairs and tired faces. On a raised metal platform stood a German shepherd, too thin for his frame, his coat dull and patchy, one leg favoring the other. His ribs pressed sharply against his skin, but his eyes, they were still sharp, not hopeful, not frightened, just watching, like he was waiting for something, or someone. Deputy Marshal Tom Greaves leaned against a support beam near the back, arms crossed, his uniform damp from the late summer heat. He hadn't come to adopt, and he certainly wasn't looking to take in a half-dead dog with no papers. He was there as a gesture representing the department showing the flag. But that dog's eyes had a gravity to them. They reminded Tom of men he'd served with, men who had seen too much and come back hollowed out, quiet, dangerous. Lot 47, the auctioneer called. Male German shepherd, approximately 6 years old. No known handler, no records. Found near the Mojave Desert. Starting bid, $25. No one moved. A few people exchanged glances. Someone in the front row whispered, "Poor thing." But still, no hands went up. The dog remained silent and perfectly still, staring into the crowd like he already knew how this would end. Tom surprised even himself when he raised his hand. The auctioneer blinked, then nodded quickly, almost relieved. Sold. $25 to the officer in the back. The gavel slammed down. The room clapped weakly, more out of awkward politeness than celebration. As Tom stepped forward, the dog didn't flinch, didn't wag. He met Tom's eyes again, calm, unreadable. Tom clipped the leash onto the collar and felt a chill crawl up his spine. It wasn't just the dog's silence that unsettled him. It was the feeling that this creature had been trained to be silent. They drove home in silence, the dog sitting motionless in the back seat of Tom's patrol SUV. Rain tapped lightly against the windshield as dusk settled over the highway. Tom glanced in the rearview mirror. The dog was watching the road, but his posture was tense, ears angled. Not relaxed, but ready. "You need a name," Tom muttered. "Riven," came out without thinking. The dog didn't react, but something in the way he held himself changed, barely, but enough. Then, just before they reached the edge of town, the police radio let out a burst of static, old, scratchy, familiar. And that's when Riven moved. Slowly, deliberately, he turned toward the sound. Not startled, not curious. He listened. His ears rose in a way that felt rehearsed. His pupils narrowed, and for a split second, Tom could have sworn Riven wasn't just hearing the radio. He was decoding it, like it meant something, like it used to mean everything. And in that moment, Tom felt a knot form deep in his chest. He hadn't just brought home a broken dog. He'd brought home a question, one that someone somewhere had worked very hard to bury. The next morning brought a heavy fog that clung low to the ground, muting the world in gray. Tom stood by the kitchen window, a steaming mug of black coffee in hand, watching Riven through the glass. The dog hadn't moved much since last night. He lay curled in the corner of the porch, eyes half open, ears twitching at every sound beyond the trees. Tom had left the door cracked, hoping the animal would come inside on his own. He didn't. It was as if Riven didn't trust thresholds anymore. Tom's house sat on the outskirts of town, isolated, backed by acres of forest and silence. After his divorce 3 years ago, it became a kind of retreat, somewhere he didn't have to explain the grief he carried. He wasn't used to company, least of all the kind that stared into nothing for hours. But when he stepped outside with a bowl of food and set it down, Riven stood up and approached slowly, not out of hunger, but caution. He sniffed the food, then looked at Tom, like he was waiting for a command he didn't recognize anymore. Later that day, Tom drove into town to run errands and left Riven behind. When he returned, nothing had been touched, except for one thing. The hallway closet, which Tom kept locked, now had fresh scratches on the doorframe. Not random ones, intentional, low and controlled, as if something had been trying to open it without making noise. Tom stood staring at the marks for a long time, heart thudding. There was nothing valuable inside. Just old uniforms, some military boxes, a locked duffel bag from his last deployment. Stuff he hadn't touched in years. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Tom lay in bed listening to the creaks and sighs of the old house, Riven resting on the floor at the foot of the bed. Around 2:17 a.m., a noise, so subtle it could have been imagination, woke him. He held his breath. A low, vibrating hum, like a growl but deeper. He sat up slowly and looked at Riven. The dog was staring toward the front door, body frozen, pupils wide, every muscle coiled. Tom didn't hear anything else, but Riven clearly did. The kind of listening that comes from training, not instinct. Tom got up, grabbed his service pistol from the nightstand, and walked quietly through the house. Nothing. The locks were untouched. The front door was secure. Still, Riven remained tense, unmoving. Only when Tom returned to bed did the dog finally relax again, though he didn't sleep. He just lay there, watching the windows like a soldier on night watch. Tom knew that posture. He'd worn it himself years ago. The next morning, Tom found something taped to his mailbox. No envelope, just a folded page. On it, typed in a cold, mechanical font. "You have him. You don't know what he is." No name, no return address, just those words. Tom felt the blood drain from his face as he looked back at the house. Through the window, Riven was staring at him, still unreadable. For the first time, Tom didn't just feel curious. He felt afraid. Tom sat at his kitchen table with the note laid flat in front of him, his coffee gone cold. He'd read the words a dozen times, but they didn't change. "You have him. You don't know what he is." The mechanical font, the phrasing, it didn't feel like a prank. Felt like a warning. And the worst part was, he believed it. Across the room, Riven sat by the door, perfectly still, his eyes tracking Tom with quiet precision. There was no wagging tail, no dog-like curiosity, just that unblinking, focused stare. Later that afternoon, Tom drove to the county records office. He didn't want to alert anyone in law enforcement just yet. Not until he had something real. He told the clerk he was looking for the intake file from the animal control pickup 2 weeks earlier, Mojave Desert, German Shepherd, male, no microchip. The woman typed a few things, squinted at her screen, then frowned. "There's no record of any shepherd being picked up that day," she said. "Closest match is a coyote found near the same area. No dogs." Tom leaned over the counter. "Can I see that coyote report?" She handed him a thin folder. Inside, a single-page report, vague and hastily written. Found near an abandoned military facility. The officer had noted strange behavior. Unusual submission to verbal cues. It read. Tom's pulse quickened. He turned the page. There was a photocopy of a tag found near the animal. Faded numbers. Partial serial. He didn't recognize it, but it looked military. Classified, maybe. He handed it back and left without a word. Back home, Tom retrieved his old duffel from the hallway closet, the same one Riven had tried to open. He hadn't unzipped it in years. Inside were medals, papers, an old field notebook, and at the very bottom a laminated contact card, one he was told to destroy after discharge. It had a number, no name, no insignia, just the words, "For use only in non-civilian emergencies." He stared at it for a long time, then slid it into his wallet. Just in case. That night, something changed. Riven followed Tom more closely, not aggressively but with intent. He stayed beside him as he moved through the house, pausing when Tom paused, tilting his head at every sound. But he still hadn't barked. Not once. And when Tom dropped a glass in the sink by accident, the dog didn't even flinch, just kept watching. That kind of control wasn't natural. It was learned, programmed. As Tom turned in for the night, he double-checked every lock in the house. When he reached the front door, he noticed fresh paw prints, damp, muddy, leading inward. But it hadn't rained since morning, and he hadn't taken Riven outside. Heart pounding, Tom opened the door and stepped onto the porch. No signs of anyone, but stuck to the outside of the doorframe, wedged beneath a loose splinter of wood, was a tiny metal tag. Burnt around the edges, barely legible, but the number matched the partial serial he'd seen in the report. And beneath that serial was a word, almost too faint to see. Recall. Tom stared at it, his breath caught in his chest. Whatever Riven was, someone hadn't just lost him. Someone had tried to call him back. Tom didn't sleep that night. He sat in the living room, the lights off, only the soft orange glow of the fireplace flickering across the walls. Riven lay by the door like a soldier on post, eyes open, body still. Every so often, his ears twitched at a sound Tom couldn't hear. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like breath through clenched teeth. Tom kept thinking about that word on the tag. Recall. Who would recall a dog? Unless it was never a dog to begin with. The next morning, Tom opened the box of military files he'd buried in the garage years ago. Training manuals, redacted memos, even a few pages of old intel reports he wasn't technically supposed to have. As he flipped through them, a symbol caught his eye, an insignia he hadn't seen since Kandahar. A black triangle over a lightning bolt. It had belonged to a private contractor group. Off-book operations, experimental programs. One rumor had mentioned the use of non-human operatives in field tests. At the time, Tom had laughed it off. Now he wasn't so sure. He pulled out an old burner phone from the same box, still wrapped in plastic. Just one number was programmed into it, the emergency contact tied to the card in his wallet. He stared at the screen for a long time. Calling meant drawing attention. But not calling meant he was alone in this. He powered it on anyway. No signal. Dead line. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't sure he was ready for answers anyway. That afternoon, something new happened. As Tom stepped outside to gather firewood, he caught Riven staring at the tree line. Motionless. Watching. When Tom followed his gaze, he saw nothing. No movement. No sound. But then, at the far edge of the woods, just for a moment, a glint of glass. Like a scope catching sunlight. It vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. Tom scanned the area, every instinct in his body firing at once. He dropped the wood and went back inside, locking the door behind him. He didn't say a word to Riven. He didn't have to. Riven already knew. That night, Tom placed a chair against the front door and kept a loaded shotgun by the couch. Around 3 a.m., the motion light on the porch clicked on. Tom jolted awake and reached for the weapon. But when he looked out the window, there was nothing. No movement, no sound, just the light, burning steady. But on the porch floor was something new, muddy footprints, boot prints, not paws, and not Tom's. Someone had been standing outside, close, listening. When Tom turned around, Riven was no longer by the door. He was sitting at the base of the stairs, staring up into the darkness of the second floor. A low rumble built in his throat, not loud, but steady. Tom followed the dog's gaze and saw nothing, but he didn't question it. Not anymore. He gripped the shotgun tighter. Something was closing in, not just on him, on both of them. Tom hadn't slept more than an hour. The world outside his windows felt too still, too quiet, like something was holding its breath. Riven, usually stationed by the front door, now paced slowly along the hallway, stopping every few minutes to listen. Tom followed him with tired eyes, shotgun resting on the coffee table. The night before had shaken something loose inside him. Not fear. Something older, like the instincts he'd buried after leaving the field, were waking back up. The muddy boot prints, the tag with the word recall, the note on the mailbox. It all pointed to one truth he could no longer ignore. Riven wasn't just a rescue. He was a message. Needing answers, Tom called Officer Rachel Marsh. I need everything you can find on the Mojave recovery 2 weeks ago. Original field notes. Not the report they gave the press. She hesitated. He could hear the tension in her breath. You think it's more than just a rescue? He didn't respond. He didn't have to. I'll call you back, she said. The line went dead. Tom's hands were shaking as he hung up. Whatever this was, It had been buried deep. And now, somehow, it had landed in his house. While searching the attic for his old floodlight, Tom came across a small, unmarked box buried beneath blankets. Inside it was a dusty audio cassette, wrapped in a Ziploc bag. He didn't remember putting it there. There was no label, just a strip of red tape across the top. He borrowed a tape player from a local pawn shop and, back home, pressed play. The recording was grainy, distorted by time. A voice, deep and clipped, broke through the static. Unit 34 active. Handler authorization, green. Subject R, 7 fully responsive to verbal command sequence. Another pause. Then, termination protocol requires Tier 1 clearance only. Tom sat frozen. R7. His eyes moved to the dog curled near the door. Riven. As the sky darkened, Tom sat beside Riven on the porch. The dog didn't move. He simply stared into the trees, posture tense, ears high. Tom placed a hand on his head, half expecting the dog to pull away. But Riven leaned in, just slightly, and for a second, the soldier inside Tom felt something that scared him more than any war zone ever had: connection. Whatever Riven had been, whoever had made him into what he was, hadn't erased everything. Something remained, something alive. Rachel called back after sunset. Her voice was low, rattled. "Tom, I found the unedited notes. That facility where they found him. It was part of a black-budget project, neurological conditioning using non-human subjects. They trained dogs for advanced psychological warfare, memory suppression, surveillance, silent communication. One subject went off-grid 6 years ago. She hesitated. Codename Riven. The line went quiet. Tom stood in the dark, phone to his ear, heart pounding. Outside, the forest groaned in the wind, and from somewhere far off, a sound like a radio burst echoed faintly through the night. They were coming, and Riven wasn't hiding anymore. The knock came at 2:14 a.m., soft, deliberate, almost polite. But Tom had been awake for hours, sitting in the dark with his shotgun across his lap. Riven was already on his feet, standing by the front door, ears locked forward, body frozen. The silence that followed was heavier than the knock itself. Tom moved slowly to the side window and pulled back the curtain. Nothing. No vehicle. No figure on the porch. But then he saw it, just beyond the tree line, faint but unmistakable. A laser sight crawling along the siding of the house. Red. Steady. Moving. He ducked immediately, blood turning to ice. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't some paranoid fantasy. Someone had come for Riven, and they knew exactly how to move. Seconds later, the house went dark, power cut. Tom rushed to the back window and spotted 2 figures advancing through the yard. Black gear, suppressors, military posture. Not police, not local. He turned toward Riven, who hadn't moved, just watching, waiting. "Back!" Tom whispered. Riven obeyed instantly, slipping into the shadows like he'd done it 100 times before. That was the moment Tom knew. Whatever training Riven had received, it hadn't faded. The flashbang came next, crashing through the front window with a burst of light and a thunderous crack that shook the walls. Tom hit the floor, ears ringing. But Riven was already moving. Fast, precise. There was a scream, the kind that comes when a throat is being crushed. Tom crawled toward the hallway and caught a glimpse of the living room. One of the intruders was down, writhing. The second raised his weapon, but Riven launched again, targeting with chilling accuracy. No barking, no chaos, just clean, brutal efficiency. When the smoke cleared, Tom stepped into the room with his shotgun raised. Glass crunched beneath his boots. One man was unconscious, the other dragging himself toward the door, blood streaking behind him. Riven stood between them, eyes locked, chest heaving. But he wasn't out of control, he was measured. Tom knelt beside the conscious one and pressed the barrel of the shotgun to his chest. "Who sent you?" he asked. The man chuckled through the blood. "You think this is the end?" he rasped. "He's not a dog. He's property." Tom felt something shift in him. Whatever line had separated man from mission was gone. He looked at Riven, whose body remained poised for more. Whoever they were, government, private, black ops, they weren't just trying to retrieve something. They were trying to erase it. Tom stood slowly. "Not anymore," he said. Then he looked out the window, heart pounding with the weight of what he now knew. They were just the beginning. By sunrise, the house was cleared. Tom moved like a man possessed, packing only what mattered. Weapons, emergency cash, a few files, and Riven's tag. The two men on his living room floor were gone, vanished before authorities could even respond. No blood, no bodies, just a shredded curtain, broken glass, and a trail of muddy prints that led to nowhere. Whoever had sent them had also cleaned them up. No loose ends. But Tom had already crossed a line. He wasn't going to wait around for a second wave. He took back roads, driving his old unmarked Jeep through towns too small to be on maps. Riven sat silently in the passenger seat, eyes fixed forward, completely still. Every time a car passed in the opposite direction, Tom's grip on the wheel tightened. He didn't know who he could trust anymore. Not his department, not federal agencies, not even old contacts from his military days. Whoever wanted Riven back had resources, reach, and no hesitation. They didn't care who got caught in the crossfire. The only thing Tom could count on now was Riven himself. They stopped at a roadside motel just past the Nevada border. Tom paid cash, gave a fake name, and parked behind the building. The room was stale, yellowed by time and cigarette smoke. Riven walked the perimeter, nose to the baseboards, tail low but controlled. Tom locked the door and propped a chair against it. He pulled out the cassette again, replaying that same mechanical voice. Handler authorization. Green. It echoed in his head like a ghost. Who had been Riven's handler? Was it someone still alive? Was it someone watching right now? That night, Tom dreamed in fragments. Flashbacks of the desert, gunfire, a black helicopter disappearing behind a ridge. And somewhere in the chaos, he remembered hearing barking. Not panicked, commanded, strategic. He woke in a cold sweat and found Riven sitting at the foot of the bed, staring at the door. Always listening, always ready. Tom sat up and whispered, "What did they do to you?" Riven didn't move, but his ears flicked, like he'd heard the question before. Just before dawn, Tom opened the motel door and stepped into the parking lot. A black SUV was parked across the road. Engine off, windows dark, no movement inside, but something about it made the hairs on his neck stand up. He backed into the room and whispered, "We move now." Riven stood instantly. No hesitation, no bark, just action. They were no longer running from something. Now they were running toward answers. Tom followed a road that didn't exist on any GPS, deep into the Nevada desert, guided only by half-memories and the scribbled coordinates from a classified folder he'd kept hidden for years. He hadn't thought about that place in over a decade. A black site used for testing weapons that didn't exist, managed by people who didn't have names. But something told him that whatever created Riven had started there, and might still be hiding something behind those concrete walls. As the Jeep rolled to a stop before a rusted gate, Riven sat up straighter. His ears twitched. His body went tense. He remembered this place. The compound looked abandoned. Chain link fencing sagged in the sun, the outer buildings half swallowed by sand and time. But Tom noticed the details others might miss. Tire tracks too fresh, a surveillance camera angled just slightly toward the access road. Not away. He parked out of view and approached on foot, Riven beside him, moving like a shadow. They passed through a side entrance where the door had been forced open long ago. Inside, the air was stale and metallic. The walls still bore the remnants of military order, faded warning signs, exposed wires, broken keypads. But deeper inside, the building began to change. The tiles turned from gray to white, cleaner, more sterile, almost surgical. They found the room by accident. It was behind a steel door half-welded shut. Tom pried it open using a crowbar from the Jeep, heart pounding. Inside was a small lab, long abandoned, but not untouched. Old monitors covered in dust, filing cabinets broken open, chairs overturned. On the far wall, a glass observation window looked into a chamber, an isolation room. In the center of that room was a metal table. Shackles still hung from its sides, and above it, spray-painted in bold black letters, the code, R7. Riven stepped toward the glass and stared inside. He didn't growl. He didn't whine. He just watched, silent, remembering. Tom opened one of the surviving file drawers. Most of it had been cleared out, but deep in the back, behind a stuck panel, he found a sealed envelope marked Handler Protocol Tier Green. Inside were photographs, grainy surveillance stills of soldiers in the field. And in several of them, clearly, unmistakably, was Riven. Not just as a dog on a leash, as part of the unit, sitting silently behind meetings, watching maps, positioned near communications equipment. In one photo, Riven stood next to a man with his back turned, tall, broad, wearing a tan tactical vest. And tattooed on his forearm, just visible under the sleeve, was Tom's old unit insignia. His stomach dropped. The photo was dated 11 years ago. He hadn't just stumbled into Riven's story. He'd been part of it from the beginning, and someone had made sure he forgot. Tom stared at the photo in his hands, the edges trembling between his fingers. It was undeniable now. He had stood beside Riven before, not as a stranger, not as a rescuer, as his handler. But the memory, it wasn't there. Nothing in his mind matched the photo. No scent, no sound, no name. Just a hollow feeling in his gut. He looked down at Riven, who sat beside the broken chair in the corner of the lab, staring back at him with something closer to recognition than instinct. Like he was waiting for Tom to remember something he no longer could. The envelope contained more. A transcript of voice logs, handler assessments, and one chilling page labeled Cognitive Separation Protocol. It described a process where human operatives had specific memories erased for operational security. Not just forgotten, removed. Names, faces, orders. Entire missions gone from consciousness, left buried under layers of psychological locks. And there, at the bottom of the page, was Tom's signature. A jagged line he didn't remember writing. He backed away, dizzy. "What the hell did they do to me?" he whispered. But Riven was already moving, ears up, nose high, sensing something Tom couldn't. Outside, the sound came fast, a low rumble. Vehicles, engines, dust rising behind the chain-link fence. Black SUVs, 3 of them moving in formation. No sirens, no warning. Silent professionals. Tom grabbed the documents, stuffed them into his bag, and looked at Riven. "We're not getting caught again," he said. Riven didn't wait for the command. He was already at the door. They exited through the back, sprinting down a narrow service tunnel that ran beneath the compound. As they ran, Tom's pulse pounded with a realization that shook him to his core. He hadn't just been chosen to find Riven. He had been programmed to forget he ever knew him. Gunfire cracked through the hallway behind them. A voice shouted, "Stop! You're harboring government property." But Tom didn't look back. He reached the tunnel exit and shoved the rusted grate aside. Riven shot through first, disappearing into the desert brush. Tom followed, lungs burning, boots slamming against dry earth. In the distance, the jeep was hidden behind a rock formation. If they could make it there, they had one more chance. One more mile between them and the truth. But as they neared the vehicle, a figure stepped out from the rocks. Dressed in civilian clothes, but the stance was military, controlled. And his voice, when it came, was worse than any bullet. "Tom," he said, "you weren't supposed to remember." And Riven stopped dead in his tracks. Tom froze. The man standing between him and the jeep was older now. Gray in the beard, lines around the eyes. But the voice hadn't changed. It reached straight into a part of Tom's mind that still hadn't healed. Commander Eli Ward, his former CO, the man who had led the off-the-books unit Tom barely remembered serving in. "You're not supposed to be here," Ward said. "This wasn't your mission anymore." Riven growled low, every hair on his body stiff with tension. Tom raised his weapon, but Ward didn't flinch. "You were never meant to remember him." The memories came like a flood, fragmented but unstoppable. Tom standing in the compound, giving verbal commands. watching Riven navigate simulated combat zones, watching him learn, adapt, obey. But it wasn't training. It was control. Tom had volunteered for something he never fully understood. A project designed not just to build the perfect canine operative, but to create a bond so deep it couldn't be broken even by memory loss. "We didn't erase you from his mind," Ward said, taking a step forward. "We erased him from yours. But he never forgot you, Tom. Not once." Tom lowered the weapon slowly. "Why bring me back into this?" Ward's expression darkened. "Because he started searching for you. No matter how far we moved him, no matter how deep we buried his code, he kept circling. Finding patterns. Looking for something familiar." Ward nodded toward Riven. "He's not a dog, Tom. He's a mirror. He was built to reflect one man's command structure. Yours. He only works for you. And if we can't control him, we have to destroy him. That was the order. Final. Clean. Erase what couldn't be owned." Tom looked at Riven, loyal, scarred, patient. Not a weapon. Not anymore. A survivor. Just like him. He turned back to Ward. "Then you're going to have to kill me first." Silence hung in the air like a loaded trigger. For a second, no one moved. Then Riven stepped forward. Not aggressive, but steady, and stood beside Tom, facing Ward. Two soldiers, side by side. Ward looked at them, then down and holstered his sidearm. "You won't run forever," he said quietly. "They'll come. Others. Ones who don't care what you two meant to each other." As the sun rose over the desert, Tom and Riven drove toward the horizon. Dust rising behind them, shadows stretching ahead. The past had tried to erase them both, but something stronger had endured. Loyalty, memory, a bond forged not in commands, but in quiet moments no one had programmed. Tom glanced over at Riven, who sat calm, alert, watching the road like he always had. They didn't know where they were going, but they knew finally who they were.